efforts to end the bitter political spat in Europe are underway. The Italian and Austrian governments are defending the current immigration policy. Political opponents in both countries say the legislation is a recipe for disaster for their borders and needs to be tightened. While France is calling for a more humane approach, Germany's Angela Merkel has been given an ultimatum by coalition partners to review the migration policy. European Union states will gather on Sunday to discuss the contentious issue as Italy insists it will no longer be Europe's migrant camp.
L'obiettivo è proteggere le frontiere esterne.
The object is to protect the external borders, not to divide the problem amongst European nations, but to resolve the problem where it starts. If someone in Europe thinks Italy has to continue to be a migrant camp, they haven't understood anything.
Punto d'approdo e campo profughi ha sbagliato a capire.
It's important for us to make the most of this moment of change and put forward a new program moving from a reactive to an active political stance, acting on the migratory system.
Asylpolitik auch tatsächlich auf europäischer Ebene zu.
Well, migration is a sensitive issue within the European Union. Let's get you more on that story now. I'm joined live from Brussels by our correspondent Kevin Ozebek. Kevin, Italy says it will no longer be the migrant camp of Europe. So how will the European Union likely respond to this hardline stance?
Well, this is why the EU is in a very tricky position right now, and that's because the countries don't view the problems exactly the same way. For example, you have a country like Italy, whose border is the external border of the EU. It's one of the frontline countries that is most impacted by the refugee and migration crisis because it is receiving most of the refugees and migrants coming into the EU. Countries like Italy want to make sure that EU asylum policy and EU asylum laws help burden some of the, or help relieve some of the burden that countries like Italy have to deal with. For example, there was a few years ago a refugee relocation scheme that was developed by the EU, but there were countries like Hungary, Poland, and Austria that essentially ignored the policy and didn't take in any refugees to help relieve some of the burden that Italy would face. Then you have other countries like Germany. Right now, German Chancellor Angela Merkel, her coalition is on shaky ground. It could possibly dissolve unless Angela Merkel comes up with an EU policy or a policy the EU can get around that would combat what's known as secondary migration. These are refugees and migrants who land in an EU country like Italy. They are supposed to get their asylum request processed there, but instead they tried to head to a country like Germany and file for asylum there. Angela Merkel is trying to crack down on that. So EU countries right now are not on the same page.
Well, Kevin, but we're talking about the suffering of people here, which has been ongoing now for years. What exactly has changed for the European Union?
Well, what has brought migration back to the very top of the EU agenda was that rescue ship, the Aquarius. You may remember 2 weeks ago, it and some surrounding vessels rescued 630 mostly African migrants. Both Italy and the other EU country, Malta, denied those ships docking rights. Spain eventually took them in, and just on Sunday, those vessels arrived and those migrants on board were able to touch soil in Valencia, Spain. But that really has triggered a lot of uproar, rows between various EU countries, and has brought migration back to the very center of the discussions happening here in Brussels. Next week here in Brussels, there is an EU summit. It was billed as a crucial Brexit summit, but now it looks like migration is going to be stealing the thunder of what the EU leaders will be talking about there.
And ahead of that summit that you've mentioned, though, European Union member states have been talking about changing migrant policies. We've heard all that before, though. So what can we expect out of Sunday's summit?
So a few things that we expect them to be talking about this Sunday during this informal summit, and then also later on the week on Thursday and Friday during the formal EU summit. One of the ideas being thrown out there that they're going to discuss is this idea of asylum centers outside the EU, most likely in North African countries. They would be EU asylum centers where asylum seekers could then apply for asylum in the EU, This would then eliminate them having to make that very dangerous, sometimes deadly journey across the Mediterranean. The EU would also hope this would eliminate the human smuggling operations that have been going around. Important to note, though, this is just being talked about. This is just in the discussion change. A few hours ago, reporters were able to ask the Migration Commissioner, are there any North African countries that have agreed to this? He says, no, we're not at that stage just yet, but that's just an idea being floated out there right now.
All right, Kevin Ozebek joining us there from Brussels. Thank you.